Hello and welcome to the fourth lesson of the beginner drawing course Lite. In this particular lesson, we're going to be talking about shapes. Now, we're starting with a fresh canvas this time because it's going to just lend itself better to all the shape work we're going to be doing. And once you have a better understanding of these shapes and how you can interlock them and sort of transform them for your purposes, you'll have an easier time drawing. Let's get into it. So everybody knows your classic triangular shapes. They're pointy, they have three different vertices located here, here, and here. Always going to be using a lot of triangular shapes in our work. We also have the favored cube. And the reason why artists tend to favor the cube is because it's widely considered the most basic geometric form of construction. I mean, cubes are how you enclose space when you don't want to use something that's more of a tetrahedron, which is basically a three-dimensional triangle. If I add a fourth vertex right there, we get our 3D triangle. So these are basically two-dimensional and three-dimensional. The two-dimensional parts are the faces, so just a square, or rather a rectangle because not all the sides are equal. This is the two-dimensional version, and you can add 6 of them up, 1, 2, 3, 4, the bottom one being 5, the top one being 6, and then you get the cube. So once you understand how to construct based on mostly these two and our friend the circle, you'll be in really good shape to draw most anything. And then it's just a matter of kind of refining your technique and finessing your ability to continue to grow as an artist by getting better at these shapes, adding more complexity to these shapes, making their relationships better. So how do we sort of practice these shapes? Well, the easiest way to do it is just to draw them a lot. But you might be asking, like, why would I learn to just draw shapes when I want to learn to draw like a dinosaur or a motorcycle or something like that? And the reason being is because we can break up most things into these shapes. And the bigger your shape vocabulary, the more geometry you'll have to, kind of look at and break down whatever it might be. But let's take the dinosaur for an example. So if I start off with a circle as just a form of construction, so I have my circle. It gives me a basis to work from. It gives me something to pull out from. Now, we don't have to use full shapes. We can also just use lines. So, for example, I might say, well, if it's going to have a nose, then I kind of want to make a point here and a point on my sphere and bring it outward, right? So I just have this rough line indicating where I want sort of the nose to start. But a line, much like our stick person, has to be wrapped in a shape. You have to sort of wrap that direction in an entire shape. So we look at these shapes and we think like, well, which one can get close to sort of the nose of a dinosaur per se? And I bet that if we sort of modified the cube, we can get a lot of mileage out of that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw the square first. Excuse me, the rectangle. Again, these are not all equal sides. A square would have like 4 completely equal sides. So that's like this. And a rectangle does not. 2 of the sides are different. So we have this square here, and I'll bring it backwards. And then we can do another square. And bring it back, and then sort of modify our shapes based on the line, based on connecting these points up where we think they might be useful. So now, again, it doesn't look much like a dinosaur. It could be a horse, it could be anything at this point, but we're just learning how to stack these shapes on top of one another and use lines to guide that process. So you'll start noticing and looking everywhere around you and finding shapes, and you know, they're very simple shapes and they're very complex shapes, but the complex shapes are just the simple ones repeated. So for example, you know, when you're doing scales or whatever, we'll get to that point maybe in lesson 5, but you would just keep repeating those scales over and over, but it's essentially the same shape, but it builds complexity. It starts to add finish, and it's just another technique. So as far as actually drawing out the rest of the dinosaur, we still have to figure out the relationship of like the eyes to the nose and whatnot. And I don't have a dinosaur handy, obviously, but I can configure, you know, where the eyes might be using like circles as indicators. And then I have to start building out the rest of the head. And I'm just taking pieces of this sphere and subdividing it. You know, I'm just taking these different parts and drawing on the forms to make it three-dimensional. So I'll add some spiny kind of head shapes. It's just a bunch of repeated sort of spikes for a detail. And this isn't any particular dinosaur because I don't have reference. I'm just using shapes to construct something. So here's the first basic version of it. You know, you've seen this version in many drawing books, I'm sure, if you've ever looked into one, where it's like, okay, so this is the simple way of doing it. This is the way where you start with your initial drawing, and then you knock this drawing kind of back with an eraser, and then you draw on top of it with a more permanent drawing. And those shapes become more refined and more naturalized. So even though we need to understand the shapes for construction, we also want to naturalize and refine them so that it actually looks like the thing we're trying to draw, which is really just, you know, more free-form shapes, but it's all based on the geometric ones. The geometric ones being the very strict sort of constructed shapes, and free-form shapes being, you know, any sort of enclosure, any sort of shape that doesn't fit on this really linear spectrum. So let's get into drawing the dinosaur head, and then we'll promptly wrap up this demo and review some shape ideas. So first and foremost, I'm just going to take this outer sort of eye socket bone, and I'm going to start placing an eye inside of it, just wrapping my lines around the shape that I want. And I know I'm going to have some sort of nose extending outwards, some sort of maw or snout. And this might take a couple attempts because I don't quite know what shape I want. I know that the nostril is going to be about right here, and I know the general shape of the nostril based on the skulls I've seen of animals, or dinosaurs in this case. And we have to have flesh over that, and then it's going to go all the way back in terms of the line that I left open here. This is going to be one fugly dinosaur because it's not referenced like that nice pretty flower in lesson 3, which you should go back and watch if you are still unclear on those things. So again, just drawing another eye here. It's basically the same circular shape. I'm just going back and forth to add a little volume. Then same sort of spikes. You see that basis is always there. That sphere is always there for me to add more shapes and complexity to. Like I could keep drawing lines to create form around these detailed spots like the eyes. And I would fill this in so that you could see that it's really deep. It's a deep nostril, so you can just keep drawing in some of those forms, add some shading. And we have sort of some sort of jawbone structure, some sort of muscles in the jaw, which are going to be not perfectly round but more squared off like this. Again, the sphere is excellent for just putting as a placeholder while you figure out the other shapes that you're going to stack on top of it. I invite you to try this by just starting with a circle and creating faces or ideas or things off of it, or starting with a square and seeing if you can do the same for vehicles. They won't be really accurate proportionally and stuff, but it's just really good to get used to constructing with these various shapes, with these various geometric shapes, with the freeform ones, and eventually you can just start stacking your shapes like I am with these sharp teeth and make your way toward a more finished drawing. You know, I could spend hours and hours getting these shapes more aligned properly, figuring out the details, and continuing to just kind of refine the drawing based on what I've established already. However, that process is mostly just a matter of finishing your work, which is a different subject than just understanding the shapes behind it and how to sort of start thinking about these shapes in a way that permits you to sort of stack them in between each other and in front and behind, like I'm doing here. See, because once you just have a bunch of shapes built up because you've drawn so much and you're excited about drawing, then you can use them to sort of fuel what comes out of your head, which is what I'm doing here. Again, just based off of things that I've seen. I don't have any reference handy, and while it's not the most accurate, it's definitely not the most accurate, it's still something. It's still a basis that I've been able to cultivate by understanding the principles behind these things. And as you continue on your drawing quest, you maybe check out the beginner drawing course, not the Lite version, but the fuller version and stuff. You start to understand these principles better, and they start working in your favor, and you can feel yourself evolving. And it's a really exciting feeling to be able to express at higher and higher levels. But I'm going to wrap up this lower jaw part here. Just bring that backwards. I'm sure you would have one of those leathery lizard necks. You ever looked at like an iguana neck or something? They're all just dry and scaly because that's just it's just how they're biologically crafted, I guess. So in essence, you can start with these real simple shapes and add a bunch of complexity later. It's just repeating the same shapes over and over, learning to draw on the form, and getting a knowledge of shape by just drawing a lot of them and continuing to refine your drawings in that way. You don't need to worry too much about the perfection of the shapes. Like if you're getting them perfect, get them as clean as you can for each time you sit down to do them, but then after that you can start to let go and really just begin to stack them in any way you kind of choose, like I'm doing here. And I'm even using some of those principles I learned from the flower, just sort of pulling the same shapes and stacking the layers. It doesn't have to be applied directly to the thing that you just studied. I don't have to draw another flower. I can use those shapes for this dude because that's what I'm drawing right now. All these things translate, and you pick up so many different things as you begin to understand the basics like shapes. So again, most things start geometric. You got to learn to draw inside of them, got to learn to sort of subdivide them, which means to break them up in various ways that make sense. Like I can subdivide this cube by cutting across the surfaces. This is the sort of stuff that will really empower you to have more volume, more understanding, and more drawing power as you continue to upgrade your shapes. Because the greater your shapes are, the greater your drawing is, and the greater your understanding and application of those shapes, the more freedom you'll have when it comes to stuff like this. But again, don't let this, like, if you're a beginner, just don't let this kind of dissuade you or let you think down on yourself, because I've been drawing for over decades and it's taken me a really long time to understand some of these things. And if you can start to get these things right now as you're sort of pursuing your quest, whether you're 12 years old or whether you're 72, it really doesn't matter, because these principles are going to work for you once you understand the principles of shape. So again, look for your circles, your squares, your triangles, and all of the three-dimensional formats of those. Find your free-form shapes and start with the basis that we've been building, those simple models that we can then wrap other complex shapes around and make some more marks around. So thank you for watching lesson 4. I really appreciate all of your support. Be sure to check out the 8 or 12 week versions of the beginner drawing course if you're ready to take your work to the next level and your expressiveness. So I will see you in lesson 5, and happy creating.